you very much for making time to join us today. My name is Kamal Tamawa. I work with the GSMA and I will be moderating the entire workshop today. Today we'll be sharing insights, views, ideas, thoughts, new research that has to do with the Spectrum Award policies and how all of that has an impact on expanding mobile connectivity. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I'll be introducing them as the sessions go through. But we will be starting off with a couple of opening remarks from Brett. Brett Tanitza is the head of Spectrum at the GSMA, someone who I like to think of as the chief spectrum officer of the mobile industry. And Brett will be sharing some views to open the webinar for us today. Brett?
Thank you, Kamal. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our GSMA Spectrum webinar. It's my pleasure to set the stage for today's event, which is going to cover a topic that we at the GSMA care deeply about: how successful Spectrum Awards can help expand and improve mobile connectivity. Why does this matter? In 2019, mobile accounted for 98% of broadband connections in Africa. Mobile is currently the only technology that can help us beat coverage and connectivity gaps in a cost-efficient way. The positive impact of mobile broadband is difficult to argue with. At the end of 2019, the economic benefits generated from mobile technology in Africa accounted for over 6% of the continent's GDP. To help build on this momentum, today we're launching our latest report that looks at the impact of spectrum policies on connectivity. It's called Effective Spectrum Pricing in Africa, and it's unprecedented in both its scope and its depth. It tracks spectrum assignments across nearly 50 African countries and examines them in comparison to other countries around the world for the period of 2010 to 2019. My colleagues are going to talk more in depth about this, but some of the highlights include that governments in Africa has so far assigned approximately half the amount of mobile spectrum compared with the global average. Also, African countries account for a large proportion of the highest spectrum prices globally once average income is taken into account. And it goes into depth about the fact that licensing more spectrum earlier and at affordable prices can pay real dividends for consumers and the broader economy. Now, our goal is never to name and shame countries. Instead, what we're looking to do is to give regulators and governments the information they need to implement policies that help improve mobile capacity and expand connectivity. We're looking to work together to make this work for everyone. So what's next? The findings have clear policy implications. Governments should release more spectrum in a timely manner to expand coverage and improve speeds and encourage adoption. As highlighted in our recently released position paper on expanding mobile coverage, the key to improving mobile network coverage and capacity is a real partnership between governments and mobile operators. Getting this right is important, and it comes with big rewards. Recent research shows that connecting all of Africa to the mobile internet by 2030 would add 5.5% to projected economic growth in the region over the next decade. I hope you find today's presentation useful. I'm really looking forward to the interesting panel debate, and please take advantage of having a bunch of experts online to answer the questions that you have. Right now, I think being able to connect virtually is our greatest strength. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Kamal, for letting me open this. And with that, I will declare the webinar open and look forward to talking with you all more. Back to you, Kamal.
Thank you very much, Brett. And our next speaker is going to be my colleague, Caroline Mbugua. Caroline is a senior policy manager with the Sub-Saharan Africa policy team and is based out of the Nairobi office. Prior to joining the GSMA, Caroline spent quite a bit of time as well with Safaricom. So she has had quite a bit of experience as well from the mobile operator perspective. Caroline will be sharing some views with us today on spectrum licensing best practice and how to make spectrum available. But just before Caroline gets on, perhaps maybe two bits of housekeeping to mention. There is a Q&A button in the options on the right-hand side. So please do feel free to post your questions on there whilst the presentations are coming on. And also, we'll be running two polls. So I'll let you know as soon as a poll is live. One has just popped up. You may want to click on the poll button. It's the second button from the bottom on the list of options on the right-hand side. So please do feel free to share your views as well through the polls. So once again, if you have any questions, please either post, preferably through the Q&A section, but we'll be happy to have them in the event chat as well. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for the introduction. Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're logged in. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to the great deliberations. And as Kamal mentioned, my name is Caroline Bugwa, and I'm the Senior Policy Manager, Sub-Saharan Africa at the GSMA, and I lead policy and regulatory activities in the East Africa region. Thank you very much for joining us and for making time to be with us today. So as Kamal mentioned, I'll be taking you through the spectrum licensing best practice and how to make spectrum available. And in this time that we see that COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on the digital landscape in Africa and the rest of the world. And the measures put in place to curb the spread of the virus have brought to light the value of connectivity for social and economic well-being of a nation. The pandemic has further highlighted the importance of a robust and inclusive digital economy, underpinned by universal access to fast, reliable internet and a range of digital services for individuals and businesses in order to support a thriving digital economy. So, coming to the topic of today, which is spectrum. So spectrum is a lifeline of broadband networks. For mobile operators to be able to provide reliable and affordable mobile services, they need to be assigned spectrum in the right amount, under the right conditions. And looking at these slides, particularly when you're talking about the best practice in terms of license conditions, we look at something like the duration of the license. Regulators can use license terms and conditions to encourage operators to invest more in their networks and thus improve service coverage and quality of service that is being given to consumers. And to give an example, when it comes to the license period, operators can make a return on a 10-year spectrum license in a highly populated area, but in rural areas, they may struggle to make a return on investment with that time frame. Therefore, a longer license period, such as one lasting 15 to 20 years, are recommended in order to encourage sufficient investment in infrastructure everywhere, including the rural areas. And looking at the issue of technology neutrality and in terms of licensing of the spectrum license, for governments that want consumers and businesses in their country to benefit from best possible mobile broadband experience, support for technology neutral spectrum licenses is imperative. Spectrum license conditions that restrict the technology operators can use or can deploy, often to maybe 2G or 3G etc., hold back mobile broadband rollout and limits competition as operators are not able to roll out the next generation technology, e.g. 3G or 4G, using the specific spectrum that they have already been allocated. So technology neutrality lets operators replace, for example, GSM with 4G and soon 5G in a particular frequency band, and do so at a pace that is driven by the market demand. So looking at the changes that we are seeing in the region, they'd be able to now move on or evolve to the next generation depending on the demand that is in the market. And this process, is called refarming, and it allows spectrum to be used more efficiently, which should always be the overarching spectrum management goal for all regulators and governments. In addition, regulators and governments should also adopt a service and technology neutrality framework to support new technologies like IoT, thereby allowing the deployment of latest cellular IoT technology in licensing spectrum bands. We therefore encourage regulators and operators and also governments in general to embrace technology-neutral licensing frameworks that will unlock the full potential of spectrum as a finite resource, and also without attempting to extract additional revenue from converting technology-specific license to technology-neutral licenses. As such, such actions hold back strong potentials to and hold back the introduction of new mobile technologies. And when I talk about moving on to talking something about coverage obligations, for instance, they can be useful, and the conditions can be used for ensuring widespread mobile services, but they must be used carefully. A delicate balance has to be done by the regulators so that you don't create extremely wide coverage obligations that can push consumer prices up because the obligations are very expensive to meet. And alternatively, operators can be required or restricted to invest in urban areas where mobile services are most in demand to finance rural network investment. As such, coverage obligations should be set with great care and balance and in consultation with operators. Furthermore, they should be factored into the price of spectrum, as expensive license coupled with extensive coverage obligations are likely to be a recipe for failure in a market. Rather than filling licenses with a variety of onerous terms and conditions, it is normally better to rely on market competition to improve consumer outcome, as onerous conditions can increase costs, restrict operator ability to invest in the network, and of course to reinvent, or rather to provide newer technologies in the market. And just to delve a bit deeper to these issues, if we can move on to the next slide, I'd like to just discuss a bit more of these challenges that I've highlighted. So if we look at this slide, when we are talking about issues on the availability of spectrum, operators should ensure that the market players have timely access to harmonized and reasonably priced spectrum in the low band, that is, for instance, below 1 gigahertz, and the mid band, and of course also the high bands, the millimeter wave, so that they can be able to provide coverage and capacity to cater to different use cases in all technology generation. This is best done through a spectrum roadmap that is developed in consultation with stakeholders in the ecosystem, including MNOs. I'm going to have a bit more, we are going to discuss a bit more about spectrum roadmap in my next slide. And the next point I'd like to bring out in this slide is regulatory certainty, which is important to attract and retain long-term investment in connectivity. Investors need to be certain of spectrum allocation methodologies, the license renewal procedure, the different projects and programs that the governments have focused on that influence spectrum availability in the future. Regulators need to think through the license renewal process. For instance, towards the end of a license term, operators are unlikely to invest substantially unless they have a clear sign that the license is going to be renewed. In our view, the renewal process should begin at around 3 to 4 years before the expiry of the license, so operators don't ease down on investment, and the whole process should not predict, should not have major changes major changes to the terms and conditions of the license should be avoided at such a time when the renewal is in progress. And if you move on to the next slide, when you're talking about the spectrum roadmaps, so spectrum roadmaps are essential to ensure that there is enough spectrum to meet surging demand for mobile services. As we are seeing it right now, in this period of COVID-19, we have seen a surge in demand for connectivity services in the region and, of course, in the entire globe. So a spectrum roadmap is one that would be able to prepare a nation for any such eventualities. And the telecommunication industry is characterized by increasing pace of mobile technology evolution and of course the decreasing cycle time for new technology demand. This means that increased agility in spectrum management and planning framework is very important. Allocation of spectrum for new users, in advance for technology becoming available is important so that operators have time for planning, capital expenditure, and for implementation. And the spectrum roadmap helps governments to forecast future trends and manage its works and, of course, the risks. The roadmap is key to the industry as it also increases regulatory certainty that we just discussed about And of course, it provides certainty about future allocation plans and management of radio spectrum, hence encourages long-term investment. And this slide shows, a few of the countries that have been able to implement spectrum roadmaps. And this is by a report by the by ITU, where we see the status of broadband in 2018. So a number of countries have been able to put spectrum roadmaps in place, but we still have a number that need to go through that journey and prepare these spectrum roadmaps, especially in Africa. Moving on to the next slide. So in this slide, I'd like us to talk about how spectrum is correctly assigned. Thank you. So how spectrum is correctly assigned. And when you look at it, we're talking about timely availability. So avail spectrum in a timely manner. And of course, ensure that it's harmonized with other, according to the directives that are shared by ITU, to ensure that the spectrum is harmonized to avoid any interferences at the international level. And of course, release the spectrum even before it's needed, so that, as I mentioned before, operators are able to plan in advance for the capital investment that is required and provide a roadmap for future availability. And when you talk about efficient assignment, so there are different ways of assigning spectrum, and in most cases, we'd encourage the use of market mechanism where there is competition that is already in the market, and of course adopt rules to preserve this competition and allow technology neutral licensing regime. And of course, when you're talking about the pricing, so set reserve prices below a conservative estimate of the market value obligation. Treat annual fees as part of the reserve prices, and avoid fees that can deter rollout. And of course, when you talk about terms and conditions, we are asking that regulators to consider terms and conditions that are not too onerous on the operator, and of course allow and encourage the investment that is required in the long term, because we all understand that the telecommunication industry is one that is very capital intensive. So looking at attracting investment for that long term service, so offering or rather granting longer durations in the license terms for this contract, so about 15 to 20 years, and of course avoid any onerous obligations on the spectrum that as I have mentioned, and of course carefully decide on protection or adjacent services only when needed. Moving on to the next slide. So here I'd like to discuss briefly on the impact of high spectrum prices, seeing that today we are discussing the issue of spectrum pricing in Africa. And of course, the spectrum pricing has an impact on three key areas in the ecosystem. So the network coverage, the network quality, and to the consumer prices. In September 2019, we published a study on the impact of spectrum prices to consumers, and findings of the study concluded that high spectrum costs lead to negative consumer outcomes by restricting the financial ability for network investment. Strong evidence from this report suggests that higher spectrum prices have a persistent negative impact on 4G coverage, as well as a negative impact on 3G coverage in the short and the immediate in the medium term in developing countries. And strong evidence also suggests that higher spectrum prices have a long-term negative impact on average network quality and 3G network quality, including downloads and upload speeds and latencies. Some evidence of negative impact on 4G network quality, particularly uploads speeds, though it's not very conclusive, but there's evidence that shows that network quality is compromised, or it's a negative impact on network quality for when prices are very high. And high prices also have an impact on the coverage, because the higher the prices, the operators would have to it takes away from the finances that the regulator would ideally set apart to be able to cover the different parts of the country. So looking at the prices of spectrum, it's important to bear in mind these issues, and looking at encouraging the operators to be able to invest and to be able to, not to be able to impact negatively their pricing strategy at the end of the day, so that it impacts on consumer pricing. And when you move to the next slide, we have a simulation that looks at, yes, thank you, yeah, that one. So there's a simulation that looks at what I'm just trying to discuss in terms of network quality. So if you look at the first line, the red line, it looks at the actual download speeds, and then the black line would look like there's some simulation where, if the operator had more spectrum, there's a 15% increase in the speeds would be about 15% faster than when the operator has less spectrum allocated to them. So this confirms that there's actually a direct relation between the quality of the network or service that consumers receive and the price of spectrum that is charged the operator at the end of the day. Move on to the next slide, please. So here I'd like to discuss a bit about spectrum auctions and the best practice. And as you can see on this slide, auctions are not the only award mechanism that exists. Beauty contests can as well work, or even a hybrid of the two has worked in some markets where you see the regulator has, selects a few candidates and of course takes them through a bidding process. So that can also work depending on the different markets that you're in. And these are various options available, as I just mentioned, and there's no single best assignment approach, but rather a need to assess the merits of each on a case-by-case basis. That is where the importance is. And auctions are most suitable when there is excess demand for the spectrum, and hence the benefit of auction in awarding spectrum to the operators, which are most likely to put into the best use, help maximize benefits to the society. And administrative assignment or beauty contests may be suitable in cases where there is less demand, or the authority wishes to consider multiple objectives, or where an authority wishes to, to avoid high license costs, which could impact network investment, as I just discussed in my previous slide. As important as the choice of general approach is, to ensure that the approach is implemented in a rigorous way is even more important. As we continue, this includes identifying key things through public consultation, weighing up trade-offs in specific design choices, noting the importance of efficient spectrum use, and ensuring competition is in communication market, and of course providing sufficient time and transparency so that potential candidates can make informed planning decisions as they plan to go into these auctions. When it comes to auctions, there is no single best auction type, and there are numerous factors that impact the outcome and of this particular auction. And on the prices, in terms of the reserve prices, high reserve prices are a growing threat to successful awarding. And of course, growing budget gaps that some governments are having in terms of looking to maximize revenue to help balance national budgets. That trend that is not, working positively for this whole process, and this does not always work. And we have seen in recent cases where several spectrum auctions have failed because governments have set high reserve prices so high that operators could not be able to afford to participate in these particular auctions. And we have seen examples in some markets like Bangladesh in 2018, in Ghana in 2015, 2019 also, and in India, and there are also a couple of other examples. And of course, focusing on achieving high prices directly impact the service, as I just discussed. And operators, regulators should look at having that delicate balance, as I just discussed, and looking at market mechanisms. So the prices be guided, the reserve prices are guided by, the market mechanisms in different markets. And of course, the method to be used to do the allocation is selected, having looked at the different merits and demerits of each process. So as I conclude and moving on to the next slide, I'd like to just discuss the summary in terms of spectrum. So spectrum should be made available at the right time, just as I had discussed. And of course, the earlier the better. So before technology is rolled out in a market, so the earlier the better. And of course, there should be a roadmap that would guide the investment, that would guide the government, or that would provide that regulatory certainty that gives information around what government is planning to do, so that operators are able to actually plan for the investment. And of course, spectrum should be given under the right conditions, and technology neutrality is important, just as I had discussed. So conditions that, of course, drive the uptake of services in this particular nation, but also don't provide an onerous obligation on operators that would deter investment in this particular market. And of course, spectrum should be given in sufficient quantity. As we have just discussed, the amount of spectrum allocated to an operator can determine or has an impact on the quality of service that the operator is able to give at the end of the day. So, provide spectrum that would be able to work in the different places. So, if in the rural areas, looking at more, coverage, and of course capacity, where if it's like the urban areas, etc. And of course, at every one time, work with these particular operators so that you have a plan that having factored in the experience in this particular market. And of course, as I mentioned, looking at pricing this spectrum that in a manner that will not be able to doesn't discourage uptake of this spectrum, as I've highlighted before, and in some of these markets. Auctions should be able to be transparent, and operators should, and all interested parties, including operators, should be able to participate, and the reserve prices should be set very carefully. In my next slide, I'd like to just leave you with some of the materials that we have done in this subject. So we have links to different materials that you can refer to after this, and that will be able to give you a bit more information around what I have discussed. I'd like to stop there, and thank you very much for listening. I'd like to hand you back to Kamal for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was very, very loaded bits and pieces of information, and I hope that people on the webinar find it useful. Like Caroline said, please do feel free to peruse a lot of the resources that we have online, and if you have any trouble reaching any of them, please do feel free to either reach out to myself or anybody at the GSMA that you know. So as you must already know, at the GSMA we do quite a lot of research into industry trends, data development, statistics. And a lot of that research is driven by our good friends at GSMA Intelligence, quite a number of intelligent people on that team. Paul happens to be one of them, one of the brains behind a lot of the economic analysis that we do at the GSMA in terms of industry trends. And today he will be sharing with us a new insights that we've come to from a bit of research that we did into spectrum pricing that has a specific focus on Africa, and show the linkages that has to do in terms of support for better and more affordable mobile services. Paul?
Thank you, Kamal, for the intro. I think it's probably the most praising intro I've had for quite some time. It's a pleasure to be here today to present this study. Over the last 4 years in the GSMA, we have developed a program of economic research to analyze how spectrum policies and prices in particular can impact mobile markets and consumers across the world. So we have analyzed in 2017, when we started this program, we analyzed with NIRA a number of high-income countries with a focus on Latin America and Europe. In 2018, GSMA Intelligence, actually, can we move to the next slide, please? In 2018, GSMA Intelligence, we looked at spectrum pricing in developing markets, and that was the first time spectrum prices in developing markets were looked at exhaustively in the way that we did. But we had very few countries in Africa in that study, just 2 or 3. Then last year, we developed and published a study where we basically studied and explored whether there is a causal effect between high spectrum prices and consumer outcomes. And we are able to establish in that study with econometric methods that are robust that they have negative economic consequences for consumers. However, despite all this breadth of work, there was still a clear and persistent evidence gap when it came to the impact of spectrum policy in Africa. And this is where the study comes in. Next slide, please. So this is the evidence gap that we address with this new study that we present today. So there is a lack of evidence in the region about the impacts of spectrum policy so far on consumers and on the mobile market more generally. And obviously this can be an issue when trying to develop and formulate spectrum policy going forward. So we had three objectives for this study. The first one is to systematically quantify and benchmark spectrum policy in Africa. The second one is to do the same for spectrum prices, look at them across Africa and compare those prices to other parts of the world. And finally was to establish how these choices around spectrum policies and price levels and the fees have an impact on consumers and the development of the market. Next slide, please. In the study for this reason, we have assembled what I think can be confidently said is the largest ever spectrum database in Africa. So in particular, we have gathered unique data on licensed spectrum between 2010 and 2019 for about 50 African markets. That includes bands, amounts, and the timings of the release of the spectrum. And we compare that with about 80 global markets for benchmarking. This benchmarking exercise also considers spectrum cost. So for that, we have a smaller but a sufficient sample of about 30 African markets. And we were able to compare that to about 90 global markets. So this benchmarking by itself already does provide new insights that, as you will see in just a moment, have quite clear policy implications. But we did not stop there. So we then looked at how these spectrum policy choices impact consumer outcomes, which is the second part of the study that I'll also cover in just a second. For the next 10-15 minutes, I'll go through the key findings of the report from the next slide. So first thing to note is that our data shows governments in Africa on average, and there's obviously quite a lot of variation between countries in Africa, but on average, they have assigned approximately half the amount of mobile spectrum when compared with the global average. We can see in this chart the average spectrum holdings per operator in 2019, which in Africa were about 80 megahertz per operator. That compares to 100 megahertz for operators in other developing markets, and 250 when we compare to the global average. And this gap is sustained both for coverage and for capacity spectrum. So when we look at coverage spectrum, on average, African operators in 2019 at about 20 megahertz, which compares to 40 megahertz for the global average. And they had about 60 megahertz for capacity, which compares to 110 megahertz for the global average. Next slide. Now, what's very important, it's one of the, I think, most interesting findings in this study, is that this gap in spectrum assignments emerged and expanded very much in the last decade. So if we look at 2010, this large gap that we just saw in the previous slide wasn't there. So spectrum assignments in Africa were very close to the global average. We look at in 2010, so on the left-hand side of this figure, the solid blue line, and we compare it to the dotted blue line, which is the figure for the rest of the world. We can see that they are fairly similar, and it applies likewise for coverage spectrum, which was very similar. That's the orange line, as well as capacity spectrum, which is the gray line. But if we look at the end of the period, so 2019, we can see that while total spectrum in Africa only increased slightly, for the rest of the world, which is the dotted blue line, that increased very significantly. Looking then, trying to unpick this a bit more, coverage and capacity spectrum both lag behind in terms of how additional spectrum was released in a slower rate than in the rest of the world, but in particular for capacity spectrum that was quite significant. Next slide, please. We also looked at the timings of the spectrum and benchmarked those across countries in Africa and compare them to other regions. What we see is that African governments on average have also licensed 3G and 4G spectrum around 3 years later on average. Again, that varies a lot between countries in Africa, but taking the average picture in the continent, it would be about 3 years later than other regions on average. So in the case of 3G spectrum, in Africa, it was awarded towards the end of 2008, typically. That compares to early 2007 for other developing markets and around mid-2005 for the global average. And the same picture was sustained for 4G spectrum and the timings of the release of the first bit of spectrum on that particular network technology. So in Africa, it was awarded typically for the first time in early 2015, and that compares to late 2012 in other developing markets and to late 2011 for the global average. Next slide, please. And we also looked at, and that's quite important and quite central to the study, we looked at spectrum prices in Africa and evaluated them, compared them to the rest of the world. The chart here shows the results when normalizing prices by income. They show that when taking income into account, the median spectrum price in Africa is 4 times higher than in the developed world and 2 times higher than the global median. And it is also higher, although not by a huge margin, but it's also higher than for other developing countries. So yeah, that's an important thing. And one particular area to note as well is that spectrum prices per unit of income in Africa on average have been particularly expensive when it comes to coverage spectrum, which in the bar chart we have marked in the dark gray bar. So it's 3.44 compared to 2.46 for other developing markets. Now, often spectrum prices have been compared in Africa to other parts of the world without taking income into account. And when doing that, we show that in the study as well. When doing that, the unit price of spectrum per population in Africa is lower than for the benchmark. But this is not particularly surprising, given the differences that we have in income between Africa and other parts of the world. And given that spectrum is an investment, it's a cost, the price levels for spectrum should logically be in line with the potential revenues in the market, which are strongly linked to incomes. And this is why normalizing spectrum prices by income is important when looking to produce any meaningful benchmarks of spectrum prices. And this is what we do in the study. And next slide, please. Another key finding from this study, from the research, is about extreme spectrum prices. We find that from all the spectrum assignments that can be considered to have had extreme spectrum prices globally, about half of them have been in Africa in the period that we studied. Spectrum prices, as we will just come to it in a second, they tend to be driven by spectrum policy choices. So while the spectrum price can logically vary between one country and another based on market conditions, the willingness to pay by operators, and a range of other factors, the sort of variations that can explain the extreme prices that we can see in this chart above the second green line, they cannot be explained by the market. So they are typically driven by policy choices that can cover from spectrum scarcity, which obviously can inflate prices, to other factors, including the format of any auction design or other characteristics of the assignment. A note on the chart that we can see here. So here we can see the spectrum prices per unit of income, and each dot in this chart represents an individual spectrum assignment. So you could have multiple dots for a given country if that country has had different assignments in different spectrum bands. And what the chart shows is a dispersion. So from all the spectrum assignment prices that we looked at, about 90% of them are sitting below what we can see there is called the inner fence. And that's basically, 90% of prices are sitting within there. There's still variation, but as I explained, this variation typically will be driven by market factors. Then there is a range of spectrum prices, those that sit between the inner fence and the outer fence in the chart, which we call outliers. So for example, Mali in 2018 or Mozambique in 2019. Those had quite high prices. They are outliers. They are, the 10% most expensive spectrum prices in the sample. And then we have what we call these extreme outliers, right? Which is the diamonds that sit above the outer fence. And these are really kind of like quite extreme, extraordinary cases. For example, you have the most recent example, Burkina Faso in 2019. Right. Can we move to the next slide, please? So finally, once we finalize this first part of the study, which I mentioned, it brings in this new breadth of data, insights, and information about the spectrum assignments, their timings, and the prices in Africa, and benchmarks them to other regions. Once that's been done, the second part of the study, what we do is we analyze whether there are any correlations between variations in the amount of spectrum or the price of spectrum and what matters for consumers, which is basically the quality of the services, the coverage of the services, as well as the overall adoption and uptake of mobile technology. What we see is quite clear in some instances. So looking at the amount of spectrum, we find in Africa that markets that have assigned more spectrum tend to have higher coverage. That's the first chart we can see on the left. We also see that markets with more spectrum tend to also have faster network download speeds. That's the chart in the middle. And finally, we also observe that markets with higher amounts of spectrum tend to encourage greater adoption. There's again a clear correlation, positive correlation between more spectrum in the market and greater adoption of mobile services in that particular market. We find the same when we look at spectrum prices in the next slide. So we see that more expensive spectrum is linked to lower coverage, is linked to slower network download speeds, and eventually also to lower adoption levels. So these findings have clear implications overall for the role of spectrum policy in helping progress the digital agenda in Africa. This is especially important in the current context of increased dependency on digital infrastructure. Key policy conclusions that can be derived from the empirical analysis that we did in the study. The first one is that governments in Africa should be releasing more spectrum. This will help expand coverage, improve speeds, and encourage greater mobile adoption. Coverage and capacity spectrum are both important. And one thing to particularly highlight is that there are bands in the region that still need to be assigned to mobile operators, not just on the sort of, say, 5G as in the future, but also for 3G and for 4G in a number of countries. That should be the initial focus. 5G obviously is the focus already in some markets. That's the focus of the discussion, but in a number of other markets, 3G and 4G spectrum assignments still are lagging behind. The second clear policy implication from the analysis is that to realize this full potential of mobile, authorities should license spectrum time. We have seen that in Africa, the timings of the assignments in some countries, not in others, are quite behind other countries with similar levels of income, and that clearly can be addressed. And if it is addressed, it would improve the consumer experience in mobile markets for those countries. Other factors to take into account here are also providing certainty. For example, by having a clear roadmap, having sufficient length in license duration so that investments can be taken forward with confidence, as well as favorable renewal conditions, so that again provides certainty that long-term investments can be recouped. The same applies also to technology neutrality in licensing, which again provides the flexibility for these investments to be unlocked. And finally, the third key implication is around spectrum prices. The high spectrum prices have been shown to be detrimental for consumers. Governments clearly can influence spectrum prices, so it is important that government policy avoids increasing prices artificially. This can happen due to a number of factors, from high auction reserve prices that, for example, risk spectrum going unsold and undermines the price discovery function of any auction, to governments creating artificial spectrum scarcity, which obviously will increase prices. So if you reduce supply, the prices increase, but that doesn't really help, as we have seen, because lower amounts of spectrum tend to have negative consequences for the market. And finally, government policies can play an important role in ensuring that the formats in auctions are appropriate. They don't result in artificially high spectrum prices. So that's all I had to cover. You can go to the next slide, just to highlight that the report is out today in English and in French. It's available for download on the GSMA website. You have the links there, and you can find all these analyses that I have just covered and a lot more there. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much for this. And if there are any questions, you can certainly get in touch with us, and we'll try to get you more details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Those were some really great insights, and I've had a chance to go through the report as well. I think there are some very, very key findings that you've made there, and I hope that regionally industry is able to take full advantage of that. As Paul said, the reports are out today, both in English and in French. They're available on the GSMA website. Please do feel free to search for them, or if you'd like, you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to share them. Next on the agenda is a panel session with a fantastic lineup of speakers, and that panel is going to be moderated by my colleague Peng, who will have the pleasure and honor of introducing the panelists. Peng is the Senior Director for Spectrum Market Engagement at the GSMA, and again, he'll be moderating the session. Peng?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kamal. Good afternoon, everyone.
Sorry, Peng, maybe just to interrupt you just before you proceed, I just wanted to mention once again that our second poll is up. So please do feel free to click on the link, and especially after you've listened to Paul, perhaps maybe you'll be able to respond and provide some of your views. Paul.
Okay.
Peng?
Yeah, thank you, Kamal. So thank you very much for participating in this panel session, and where I have the privilege to be joined by 5 very distinguished panelists from the government, industry, and also intergovernmental agencies. So hopefully this will lead to a very insightful debate. Just to introduce the panelists, first one, you probably don't need introduction. Mr. John Omo is the Secretary General of ATU, who will be giving us a quick opening speech as well. Then we also have Mrs. Anvita Samboga, the Program Officer from the ITU Regional Office. Mr. Tom Olwero, the Director of Spectrum from the CA in Kenya. Then we also have 2 industry colleagues, Mr. Bertus MK, the Group General Manager of Technical Regulation from MTN. And last but not least, Mr. Shiletsi Makafane, Head of Government and Industry Relation in Ericsson. Just a quick word of housekeeping. As Kamal mentioned, you have the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A function on the right-hand side. I already see 2 very good questions there, and we will take that to the panelists soon. I will also ask the panelists to discuss a bit the results of the poll. But first on, I would like to ask SG, Mr. Omo, to give a few introductory remarks for this panel. John, please.
Thank you very much, Zhao. Thank you very much, fellow panelists. My name is John Omo. I work for the African Telecommunications Union as the Secretary General. Really, my opening remarks would essentially be to confirm what the earlier speakers have quite ably said that to deliver affordable, widespread, and high-quality mobile broadband service by operators, there's certainly a requirement for predictable access to efficient and necessary spectrum. Spectrum still remains the lifeblood of mobile broadband mobile connectivity in most parts of Africa, and so a predictable market in terms of regulatory practice, in terms of policies is necessary to enable operators access that resource in a way that is certain, in a way that is predictable, and in a way that guarantees their investments. So much so that the issue is what then are we doing from our various perspectives, either as regulators, intergovernmental organizations, or the mobile industry itself, in ensuring that that ideal is gained. And so in my next few remarks, I will focus on what this organization, the African Telecommunications, is doing in that regard. But I'm certainly happy to be here, and I would, once my time comes, I hope concentrate on what we are doing in that regard. Over to you, Zhao.
Thank you very much, Mr. SG, for the words to open this debate. I think maybe I can ask the first question, just follow up with you, SG. The ATU has been really kind of instrumental for the preparation for the ITU and WRC issues on spectrum. But recently, ATU has established several groups who work on harmonized approach on the best practice on spectrum management. Why do you think that is important for the ATU and more importantly for the region and the continent of Africa?
I think consensus building is important when one is managing a resource as important as radio spectrum. And so you want to ensure that all shades of opinion are brought to bear in terms of policies, in terms of regulations, in terms of operational practices on the use of accessibility and use of this spectrum. And so we have, as part of our activities post WRC 19 and in preparing for WRC 23, established, as you say, a couple of teams that are working on spectrum management recommendations. Of course, we are doing this with many of our partners, our members in this regard. But I think the more important thing is to bring all shades of opinion, industry, regulators, government, intergovernmental organizations, all interested parties, to have their opinion bearing on how we should develop spectrum policies in Africa and the use of this resource in a way that represents shades of opinion of various players, so that whatever we develop is acceptable. And in that regard, we have come up, at least in draft form for now. The work is still ongoing. We do hope to complete it in or about February next year. But it's representative of, as I've said, industry, government, regulators, and even the civil society. And what is coming up, as I've mentioned before, is the need for a clear roadmap. I think Caro has said that quite a bit. Protection of incumbent services, regulators needing to publish information openly for people to access, not setting up auction prices too high as to be beyond the reach of most organizations that will bid, or if they do bid for that service, the high prices are essentially transferred to the consumer. That affects the rollout of services to the consumer. So there are a raft of various recommendations that are coming up, still in a preliminary form, but more or less confirming what the GSMA study that has been highlighted by the two previous speakers have highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, SG. I think that's really excellent news. And looking forward to see the outputs of this important work. Before going to the next few questions, I think I just want to look at the results of the first poll. I think the question was, when government awards spectrum, what should be prioritized? And you can see the results on the right. I'm quite surprised, in fact, that it was so much a clear cut. Most of you have answered that the long-term socio-economic benefits to the citizen is the most important issue, and the spectrum is an enabler for digital economies. I just want to invite any panelists to see whether there's any feedback, quick comments, whether that surprised you. I don't know if anyone want to volunteer.
I mean, if I may come in, thank you.
Yes, please, Shiletse.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think I think what we see there is that the societal impact is very important to be able to look into that. And I think with the era that we are in, with the COVID-19 impact, I think we've seen more and more people working from home, and more highly dependency on the ICT to be able to keep our society moving, to keep our society connected, and also to be able to keep the businesses going. So therefore, the view from how you view the ICT, and which I think in the presentation it was said very well in the opening about this is very key in terms of the mobile broadband. So now the role that it's playing, I think it becomes even more key that we don't just look at it as a immediate short-term connectivity aspect. Is becoming a very key GDP driver, is becoming a very key economy driver. And also, if we look on the future of the generations, they cannot miss education, they cannot miss other things. How do we bring this ICT now to be able to play even a much more bigger role? So therefore, the societal impact, I think, becomes very much more important to be able to view at this going forward. So that would be my interpretation of that.
Mm.
Thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Shiletse. And I think my personal interpretation is that we are preaching to the converted, maybe in this audience of spectrum experts. I think we all know the importance this come through, but I think it's also quite important to have proof points. And I think hopefully our reports that Power presented will help you to convince your national stakeholders in such area. But I think maybe the next question for the ITU, for Anrita, please. I think as we've seen, there's a lot of governments, often finance ministries who look at the spectrum as a kind of national resource, and they should exploit and get as much as the kind of spectrum as much as a fee as possible. I mean, as an international authority of the spectrum, like the ITU, you probably see much of your member states considering this, and what is the ITU recommendation to those governments and regulators? Anrita, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the GSMA for extending ITU the opportunity to speak at this forum, and for the excellent reports that you have released this morning. And I'm glad that the question that the panel was raised came right before I spoke, because I wanted us to, as ITU, we are committed to connecting the world and protect everyone's right to communicate. We want to connect everyone and everywhere. And like you had maybe this morning and over the course of this COVID pandemic, we have still 900 people in Africa who are not connected. And in the post-COVID world, this state is no longer acceptable. So we need to push more connectivity in the world. So as much as we have an industry engagement and as much as we're having policy engagement, the question is, what are we advising our policymakers? I want to say that we are advising our policymakers that possibly to start considering hybrid approaches for spectrum pricing and allocation. Hybrid that look at both the market-driven considerations as well as combining the social and economic equity considerations, so that we have that last 900 million people in Africa connected. So, and we seeing a good silver lining with this COVID pandemic. Most of our governments in the region are waking up to the realization that the sector is not just for tax collection and revenue generation. They need to digitalize their economies. They need to make sure that all the critical sectors of health, education, and government services are connected, meaningful and affordable connectivity. So we're seeing many of our governments redefining their digital policies, and we're advising them to look at a holistic ecosystem approach where they can have both addressing the supply constraints, which is the spectrum and infrastructure requirements, and the demand constraints like affordability and digital skills. So as these governments are reviewing their spectrum or digital policies to connect everyone and to include everyone, we are advising them to start looking at spectrum in terms to review their spectrum allocation or management strategies, taking into consideration the long-term development aspirations of the countries. Again, we need looking at digitalizing the economies and the society and improving the quality of life for citizens. So the long-term consideration, we're trying to emphasize it as much as possible, not only the market-driven considerations, but also the long-term aspirations. So we're also advising them to look at a holistic ecosystem approach. Again, I've talked about that, demand consideration and supply consideration. And we are also advising them to engage as widely as possible. And I'm glad that the SG for ATU has also mentioned this. Engagement is very critical in this process of redefining spectrum policies and strategies. The sector has disintegrated. We have so many people in the value chain, so many players. So it is very important that we engage. The engagement has to be at national level and harmonization at ATU and the regional economic level so that we have a coordinated approach to spectrum management. Again, both sides have to be talking together so that we have some understanding. We're also advising them to explore innovative approaches for spectrum management, hybrid models with consideration of increased role of the industry or self-regulation. You've heard of our ITU 5 models for regulation. We're looking at other issues such as spectrum sharing, again, to support the connecting of the last people, refarming, among others, and pooling of resources. And then, but most important as well, we are telling them to make sure that their rules are clear. They have specific defined regulations for spectrum management to adhere to the principles of transparency, non-discrimination, and technology neutrality. Again, engage. What is evident is that our policymakers don't have sufficient data to inform policy processes for management. And this discussion this morning is critical because you're providing policymakers and stakeholders with critical data that will be used to inform future policy processes. So my take is engagement, discussion. We are redefining, governments are redefining their policy approaches, and I think this is a right opportunity to have this kind of dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anrita. I think that's really wise word and a lot of recommendation there for each government and regulator take away there. I just want to switch. First, can I confirm whether Tom is back? I saw that Tom dropped off. Okay, while he sort out his connectivity issues, I just want to switch quickly to the Q&A. I saw quite a few really good questions. I just want to see whether any panelists want to take those. The first one I saw is from Aliu from Nigeria. The question is, administrative assigned spectrum is later sold to a higher price in the secondary market. This led to use of spectrum trading guideline to recoup some part of the gains made by the seller and by the government. How do we strike a balance with advocacy for moderate spectrum pricing? Is there any panelists who want to take a shot at that?
Thank you very much. I think Anrita has spoken to that issue, and I want to thank Aliu for the question. I think insofar as we subscribe to a free economy, spectrum, a resource that is available for use out there should be available for trading. And so there is certainly a need for a delicate balance between socio-economic needs of a community vis-a-vis the real needs of an operator to be able to sell spectrum in the secondary market, for example. And so, balancing those socio-economic needs and the needs of, free enterprise being able to sell whatever resource is already assigned to you needs to be balanced. But insofar as, there's free enterprise and an operator sees an opportunity to perhaps make some little money out of trading in spectrum, or having smaller chunks of it and reassigning it to other smaller operators in the secondary market is something that we will need to live with. Certainly, it's a system which most of our regulators have accepted. But the balance needs to be, as you trade in a secondary market, would connectivity needs of the population, the real needs of government to ensure that there's connectivity, would those still be fulfilled as a result of that secondary trading? So if those are met, those needs are met, I think we will have to live with secondary trading. But if secondary trading leads to an operator holding resources more than is necessary, perhaps to stop other people from accessing that very resource, then I think a regulator needs to move in to stem out that practice. And so it's a delicate balance of various policy choices that are necessary to ensure that the market is vibrant, the market meets the needs of accessibility, and still conforms to commercial dictates of having a resource easily available out there for those that require it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, SG. I think definitely I agree. I think the regulator should probably have some mechanism to deter any kind of speculators. I mean, to impose some of the condition when they award the spectrum, especially when they do so in an administrative manner. I want to switch quickly to another question just related to that from Suzio. Is the use of auction the best method to allocate optimal spectrum, and how else can the spectrum be allocated and meet the need of industry players and government with the need to raise revenue? I'm looking at my industry colleagues. Any reaction to that one?
Yeah, okay. I mean, if I may come in, maybe not answering it directly, Bertus will come in there. I think it's you need some sort of a mechanism, obviously, to be able to say, how do I give or how do I make an award? But I think what is important I can highlight is that there needs to be a policy objective that the country needs to say, this is the policy objective I need to drive. And I think what we have seen coming to the questions that were raised earlier, is that the role of ICT as it's been viewed now has changed. The role that on how it's driving the society has changed. So therefore, your policy objective needs to talk to those areas, coming to the first question about the socio-economic impact, to be able to say, how do I then design a mechanism that I can be able to give or make sure that the spectrum is in the hands of the parties that will be able to help drive coverage, drive capacity, but also helps you to be able to reach those socio-economic objectives that you have as a country. So I think this situation we're in COVID is demanding a lot of redefinition because I think the world as we had it before COVID and the world as we'll have it after COVID is two different worlds. And I think we need to appreciate a lot of redefinition that we need to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. And for my part, I mean, as GSMA, what we think about the spectrum auction is that I mean, auction is a good mechanism when you have, you have a more demand than supply, and then that's probably the fairest and the most transparent way to get the spectrum to the stakeholder for them to deploy. But when you look at the spectrum, and if there's not a lot of demand compared to the supply, then sometimes you have other mechanisms like beauty contest or administrative assignment directly as well. So there's no kind of one size fits all. I think it really depends on your market and depend on the current situation and how much the industry needs the spectrum at that point. I see Tom is back. I just want to bring him in as well. I know that we were discussing about different policy and what we should drive the kind of the spectrum awards, and Kenya has always been one of the early mover on the continent, and in fact we as GSMA we developed a few years ago even case studies reports on how Kenya successfully managed the digital switchover and released the digital dividend spectrum to the industry on time. Can you let us know a little bit what policy has been driving your approach on the spectrum management in Kenya and in CA? Tom, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Zhao. It's a great opportunity to be able to converse with this vast forum. And there are several policies which have been driving our approach to spectrum management. First of all is our strategic plan. And the strategic plan of the regulatory body here is the mission is to build a connected society through three things. First is the regulation and partnership and innovation. Those have been the pillars on which we have been operating. And we also have the national ICT policy of Kenya, which has adopted a mobile-first approach to ICT service provision. And this policy actually prioritizes mobile services to ensure that every Kenyan has a reasonable access by focusing on mobile and wireless infrastructure. Further, Kenya also does have a wireless broadband spectrum policy. Among other key objectives, aims to ensure the benefits of digital dividends, which we started taking advantage of in 2015 after we had done successful migration. So this aims to maximize as well as maintain consistency with the provision of the agreement of the ITU. And some key principles for spectrum management specified under the policy. First of all, enable and encourage spectrum to move to its highest value use or uses, and also to ensure access to spectrum resources is simplified. Third is to ensure technology and service neutrality, which the previous speaker have talked about and emphasized, and also to ensure the least cost and least restrictive approach to achieving policy and clear conditions in a transparent and equitable manner. Overall, PA has actively promoted efficient spectrum use across multiple bands, and not only the UHF digital terrestrial television band. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that. I think it's definitely a really good example on the continent, but we have many others, of course, on the regular in Africa continent. I just want to switch quickly to the second poll. The second poll results are out as well. So the question was, what is the danger of setting a high reserve price during an auction? I think quite a vast majority has answered the answer B. It will artificially increase the final price paid with the risk of reducing network investment and a high consumer price. I think that's definitely good. I'm really glad that no one answered picked the answer D, where there's no danger. But I just want to say that, you know, and the other two, personally, I would pick all the three, in fact, A, B, C, because it does have issue with discouraging, you know, participation and leave the spectrum to be unsolved. But also the whole goal of spectrum auction and the fundamental purpose of a spectrum auction is to allow the market discovery and to find out what exactly the final price is. So I think at this point I want to move to Bertus for the MTN view. Just, you know, many kind of recent economic works, including the one that Paul just presented, say that, you know, in places where spectrum is really expensive, the network quality and the coverage are not so great. So I'm sure MTN, of course, network is great everywhere. But what is the kind of is that finding generally true to the industry? How do you see that as a mobile operators? And can you understand? Can you help us understand what is the general spectrum policy that lead to this situation? Bertus, please.
Thank you, Ping. Thanks for the opportunity to answer that. I think we need to start by recognizing that a regulator's task is not always that easy. I don't think it will be new to anybody on this call to understand that obviously the principal task that he needs to concern himself with is the proper application of this very scarce resource. Make sure that he maximizes the utility for the broader population, and then the normal things like promoting competition, encouraging investments in the sector, and then to encourage fairness as well. Sorry, can you hear me?
Sorry, there's some noise on the line. Ask the technical moderator to have a look. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry, Bertus, please continue.
No problem. But I think we need to recognize that although we need to promote investment in the telecommunications sector, the regulator is also the modulator to balance the opportunity to attract foreign investment by multinational operators with the need and the responsibility to afford the general population the benefits of a modern connected society with affordable prices and then good quality. But more closer to home, as an operator, we realize that we are only able to commit a certain amount of capital towards an investment, specifically license for new spectrum assignment or for a renewal of that. Whatever is overpaid as an upfront fee for that spectrum will inadvertently manifest as the inability to aggressively commit capital for a capable coverage rollout. Well, speaking for myself, from a return on investment perspective, I would rather pay less for spectrum and invest that same excess amount in expedited coverage provision. But now we also need to look at transparency with regards to how we pursue this coverage obligation, whether the regulator requires us to use this specific band, which is being contested for part of a spectrum auction, or whether we need to pursue coverage with our broader spectrum strategy. And I mentioned this because we've seen spectrum auctions for 2600 megahertz band, but then this specific band has a coverage obligation in rural areas as well. And you'd agree with me that that's not a match in terms of the general strategy that a mobile operator would follow in terms of utilizing his collective toolbox in terms of various spectrum bands. Then I think we need to also recognize that in probably the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen many promising emerging players in Africa, and they've attracted favorable interest from the regulators and policymakers, and they managed to get lucrative spectrum allocated to them with the very amicable intent from the regulator and governments to level the playing field to a certain extent. But then we've been witness to the ultimate battle that they always had to achieve scale. So I believe there also needs to be a balance exhibited between a commercial intent of a player who hopes to clinch that lucrative spectrum and the associated coverage obligation. And I think this speaks to spectrum trading as well. We've seen many smaller players in the past that clinched lucrative 800 megahertz spectrum, for instance, and they did very little with this. They literally just held this for 4 or 5 years, hoping to sell it at a profit. We also see some divergence during auctions when, I suppose, well-meaning regulators inadvertently create artificial spectrum scarcity. For instance, out of the 2 by 30 megahertz available in the 800 megahertz band, a regulator would sometimes want to test waters by making available only 2 by 10 megahertz. And we've seen this puts immense upward pressure on the paid price, because 2, 3, sometimes 4 operators would all want to lay their hands on this lucrative band, and ultimately overpaying results in the customer suffering. Yes, let's understand the eventual contribution to the general fiscus would be much greater, but it will come at the expense of a stifled rollout. I agree what Caroline mentioned earlier. One does not always have to go the spectrum auction route. Duty contests can work as well. But however, here a regulator will have to be very, very robust in the analysis of a bidder's commitments and truly assess their ability and likelihood to achieve what they promised to do. They also need to regard a wide range of objectives. I think Tom mentioned this. We should not only concern ourselves with coverage, but the general social upliftment responsibility, and then the peripheral industries such as banking, the unbanked, online education, etc. What for me is important as well is I think regulators need to strike a balance between the upfront fee to pay for spectrum and then the annual fees. This for us as an operator is a huge uncertainty. What we find ourselves in the tenure of a given license facing drastically hiked annual spectrum fees, which in many cases doubles, triples, or quadruples through the tenure of the license. We also need to guard, I think, against spectrum auctions that allocate large chunks of spectrum to wholesale entities or exclusive assignments to incumbents or single players, because this puts upwards pressure on the remaining lots of spectrum. And we've seen from experience that this also results in slower growth and generally lower quality network experience compared to a complete commercial market where all the operators strive for network excellence. And I think lastly, we once again need to concern ourselves with the technology neutrality and the converse specificity in these bands. We face the consistent battle by renewing licenses and then finding in the small print that there's still some kind of a technology specificity associated with legacy assignments in previous licenses. And I think mobile operators should be allowed the opportunity to decide where and how they want to apply specific technologies in specific bands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertus. I think you raised a lot of really important points. One thing I want to pick up on is like for the annual spectrum price as well. On the report that Paul presented, that includes only the results based on the upfront spectrum price. But as you indicated, some market has been charging quite really high annual spectrum price as well. So the result may look even bleaker for the industry, at least if we were to include that. I want to shift a little bit the focus of the panel to a bit more forward-looking. I mean, as we demonstrated on the report, the gap between the developed countries and Africa continent has been, in some cases, even getting larger over the last 10 years. We were hoping at least that 4G or future next generation of the technology will be able to to bridge the gap with the developed market, but it seems that the gap is getting even bigger. So I just want to ask SG from the ATU perspective and from a regional perspective, what is likely the importance of 5G mobile broadband for you and for the economies around Africa, and what the kind of the key building blocks would be for a successful introduction of 5G on the continent?
Thank you very much. I think it's agreed that 5G essentially is a bouquet of various generations, and so there's probably no 5G without 3 or 4G. It's a bouquet of various generations. But I think the scenario in Africa is such that there are already test runs in a couple of countries with regard to the 5G technology. We as the Continental Union are working on with our policymakers, with our membership on various policy choices that would inform the management right from licensing and availability of this spectrum for industry and for various services that is required. But in terms of the key factors that would inform its use in Africa, I think there's certainly a clear need for an enabling policy and regulations that is stable, that is predictive in terms of how it will be accessed and used. Certainly, in terms of equipment in Africa, it's still a gray area. Much of this equipment is imported into Africa, and so in terms of how the standards for this equipment will interface with the existing networks, it's something that our policymakers and regulators need to give attention. In terms of other enabling infrastructure and existing infrastructure, there will need to be clear policies and regulatory practices to ensure that there's more and more sharing of existing infrastructure, so that networks that are building this technology do not have to use sort of a virgin access the market as if there's no infrastructure that is existing. But the more important thing for me is the use cases. I think we are seeing in other markets indications that this resource is not just about operators. It's about hospitals, it's about schools, it's about health, it's about agriculture, it's about several transformative aspects of our society. And the policy choices that we have to work with is essentially, does a hospital in Johannesburg need to operate its own network, or does that hospital need to rely on MTN to run this backbone network on its behalf? And I think there's need for more policy debate on this. I have a personal preference. I think hospitals need to do, for example, what they are good in doing, which is treating people, and leave the running of networks to people who are good in running those networks. But these are some of the policy choices that I still think we need to debate going forward, because we are increasingly seeing indications in other jurisdictions that if an agricultural company needs to run a network in terms of managing agribusiness, why not, and why does that network have to be run on its behalf by someone else? But I think there's more. It would be much better to leave organizations that are specific to their industries, like mobile operators, to run these networks on behalf of hospitals, on behalf of educational institutions, and leave educational institutions to to do that which they do best, which is educational content. So I think they are still it's still a gray area in terms of the policy choices that are available. But suffice to say that an enabling policy and a clear regulations in terms of access, in terms of availability, is still something that we need to see. In terms of use cases, we need to audit what is the best model for this continent. As I say, we have cases, a large number of swaths of land in Africa where even 2G technology is still non-existent. And so, given the choice, a government would still say, I need to provide basic telephony to an area that is still not having this service, as opposed to 5G. But I think, as I say, it's a bouquet of various generations of networks. And I think policy choices that ensure that the non-adoption of an earlier generation does not mean that you don't adopt current generation needs to be adopted. And I think those are some of the policy issues that we need to deal with. But the key success factors is for me a clear and an enabling policy and regulations for market access to ensure that there's connectivity in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, SG, for that. I'm not sure whether there's any reaction to those wise words from SG, from our industry colleagues. I just wanted to flag that, SG, you raised a few really interesting points, but we, as GSMA, we also have developed quite a few industry position, and those are available on our website. Industry position about typically verticals, how do we treat verticals from the spectrum perspective, but also things like the coverage issues that we just published a lot of kind of good case studies that how different countries have been addressing their coverage issues. So all this will be available, are already available on our website. So I just want to switch to Shilezi as well. I think it's a kind of similar question to SG. I mean, how do you define a kind of a pro-investment regulatory environment from the industry perspective, and what do you want to see more happening as a spectrum policy on the Africa continent, let's say?
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for that, and I think very good points that the SGS put in there. And obviously my addition there would be first in terms of the policy. I think it's very important now to see that it's not only an ICT issue. I think we need to start looking into a cross-cutting policy approach. I mean, ICT now is starting to drive. We talk about the mining sector. We need to think about the mining sector. What are the things that we need to make sure that there is a policy to be able to create demand? If you look on the transport sector, ICT can play a very big role there in terms of the efficiency in that sector. Then how do we make sure that there is a cross-cutting policy that builds into that? The other point that I just want to highlight as well is about long term. I mean, it is important. This is a very highly capital intensive industry to be able to lay out the infrastructure. You need to be able to can scale. You need to be able to can take time to be able to return your investment. So therefore, the issue of certainty in terms of how long you have your license to be able to operate is very important. I think that needs to be looked into. The other thing as well is about at the point that you have reached peak in terms of investment, because the technology keeps on changing. You need to remain competitive in the market and globally. You need to have that certainty that if my license is going to expire in the next 3 years or 5 years, there are clear rules on how do I continue, so that then you can keep on keeping that investment cycle going on. So I think that that's very important to be able to look into that. The other thing as well is just to make sure that as well that there is that element I raised earlier as well, which you raised in your call in terms of the social impact is very important. And we need to make sure that always these technologies talks to going to make a difference to our society. And I think if we keep that line of sight, we keep on obviously making sure that we are able to ensure that more and more people are kind of benefiting and getting a difference with this technology. The other point as well is more general on the regulatory certainty, and I think this some of the presentations talked talk to those issues. A point around obviously harmonization of the regime to be able to make sure that you can enjoy economies of scale, because it's very important. Because as an investor or an operator, you don't want to be subject to these rules in one country and then you move to the next country completely different. I think there's somewhere where we need to be able to can align on that. And I think just to give an example here, the SG talked about equipment a little bit earlier. I think at this point of type approval as well, I mean, just lingering on that is one of the major things that could be some of those things that if you align around spectrum and then you align around the requirements, and you should be able to make it easy that if I deploy this in Zimbabwe or Zambia, within a harmonized environment, you should be able to can do that anywhere you move in the continent. So those are the kind of things that I think will be very key pro-investment environment, because then they kind of create the investor with that certainty, and then also you give the investor with that scale, and also you provide the investor with the ability of the use cases or the demand side, because then it's easy to come in, provide services. We talked about 5G, which is more about industry transformations. So therefore, that helps you to be able to build your business case for the long term as well. So I would say those are the main ones. And I think some of the other points my colleagues has mentioned in terms of technology neutrality and that. So I'll just add those few ones that I've added now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shileti, for that. We're arriving to the close almost of this panel. Before I give a last chance to all the panelists to make a final 30 seconds, 1 minute takeaway, I just want to recognize my good friend Daniel Obam has been really active in the Q&A session. Thank you so much for all the questions. I hope some of those detailed questions my economist team, Paul, were able to answer those. And also see a last question from Melvin. I probably would ask my colleague Kamal as a conclusion of this whole workshop to answer that, to take that question at the same time. So just to close this panel, I would like to ask each of the panelists to give us 30 seconds or 1 minute key takeaways, what you want the audience from today to take away from your message. Shall I start with the SG? Mr. Omo, please. Sorry about. Yeah, sorry. You no, it's okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhao, for getting me to bite the cherry again. I think policy and regulatory certainty is the key that will unlock, spectrum use in Africa. We have a great need for access. A large part of our population is still not having access to the digital tools that facilitate pretty much our day-to-day lives. And we need to ensure that we work with our governments, we work with our regulators, and indeed every player that is involved, cooperation rather than competition, in ensuring that we close the digital gap in ways that, guarantee business certainty, but also access needs of our population. And that will, of necessity, require that we work a lot more together. We work a lot more together rather than governments seeing themselves as custodians of this resource and operators seeing themselves, as people who get into the market to tell governments how they should release or manage this spectrum, so that together we work to close the digital gap, as opposed to each and every party pulling in different directions. And I think that way then we have a great opportunity, more so brought by the needs of COVID and going forward. Most of our meetings will now be virtual. Interaction will be a lot more online, and we need to ensure that the society that is still outside this technology is brought in accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SG. And Rita, can I ask you for some concluding remark?
I totally agree with the SG that we need to work together as a community, a common goal to move everyone together up to improve our lives, quality of life using technologies. I also want to mention something that we didn't talk about, capacity development. We have to appreciate that most of these things, especially at the policy end, the appreciation on some of this development is still limited. So we need to continue engaging and building capacity for policymakers to effectively define policies that are futuristic. And I want to encourage people on the forum to look at the ITU platforms of Academy, where we have a range of spectrum management courses. There's one that is coming very soon in December, where we have a course with ITU and GSMA on 5G capacity building for the Africa region. We encourage our policymakers to continue building their capacity and plan and be futuristic in defining policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anrita. And it's really good point to raise the capacity building. I think the new technology development, I think this is something that is great to offer from the ITU perspective, but also from GSMA, we have a capacity courses. I want to move to Tom. Any concluding remarks? Ms. Olwell?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Zhao. I think it's been a very, very elucidating section. And one take home I would go with as a regulator is the correlation that has come out with regarding the amount of spectrum released and how that really impacts on the market, both coverage and capacity spectrum. I think that's a big takeaway. And issues like how that impacts on quality of service, that was quite important. And the pricing of the spectrum, how it's determined and how a higher spectrum can come out again, have a negative impact, as much as the government would want to use it as a source of revenue. So there are really a lot of take-homes here about as we continue playing our regulatory role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Bertus, any final insight from the industry perspective?
Yes, thank you, Ping. I think we've identified quite a number of the detractors of healthy spectrum policies, and I mean, through this brilliant report from the GSMA, we've seen absolutely undeniable evidence of what goes wrong, but also what can go right. So I think we do not have to repeat the mistakes of too little, too late, too expensive. We have the opportunity to embrace 5G and the policy considerations around that and not make the same mistakes again. I think as developing markets, we might think that 5G use cases, as is stated at the moment, do not directly match requirements for Africa, and that we are a couple of steps away from truly embracing the fourth industrial revolution. But I think if we look at specific cases, fixed wireless services being one of them. We see large players like AT&T in the US using that as a fiber replacement. Now, there for me is a very good match with what we've already achieved with 4G and terminating connections over Wi-Fi, which is a very pervasive technology, but using your mobile technology to backhaul. Immediately you mitigate the problem with the availability of affordable 5G devices. So we will definitely be actively playing in this space. And similarly, I expect our competitors in our markets to also make speedy moves in terms of doing initial 5G launches. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bertus. Looking forward to bring the 5G on the continent. Shiletsi, you have the final word, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Peng, for the opportunity. And I think my takeaway, the study has kind of given us that link in terms of the spectrum pricing to coverage, quality, and the consumers. And I think turning that into a positive side, I think it is time then to be able to then rethink as we move into this space after now WRC 19, as we come in with this new spectrum, the 5G. It's going to be very important to then look into how do we then bring in these new technologies in a way that we are affording the players to be able to have the right bouquet of spectrum so that they can be able to deliver coverage, quality, and also benefit the consumers. And then the other aspect as well is to be able to look into how do we then use this spectrum tool to be able to digitize the economies and also digitize the businesses to be able for the benefit of the society going forward. So thanks very much for that, and I think it's quite an interesting study and very good insights that we can draw from that and learn for the continent.
Thank you very much, Shiletsi, and thank you. I want to thank you, everyone, all the panelists, and I think if we could clap, if the audience could clap on the virtual setting, they would. It was really definitely an insightful panel. I apologize to the audience that overrun by a few minutes, but I think the discussion was really good. I couldn't stop that. I think at this point, I want to hand back to my colleague Kamal for the final concluding remarks. Kamal, please.
Thank you very much, Peng, and thank you to everyone who has contributed to the success of this webinar. I think it's been very, very insightful. I see there's still a couple of comments, perhaps maybe that are Q&A. With regards to the question from Melvin as to whether there's been any successful auctions in Africa, I think I could cite maybe one or two examples. Tanzania did a fairly good process a couple of years ago. I think it's just over 2 years ago where they assigned the 700, especially with the focus as well in terms of ensuring that the spectrum is used to provide coverage as opposed to the short-term gains of looking for revenues from the assignment of those spectrum lots. Mozambique did a fairly good one as well, to some extent, in that part of the spectrum that was available was sold at a fairly reasonable reserve price, even though a lot of it, some of the other bands that were on offer at the time also turned out to be too expensive when bought. I think in Nigeria, many years ago, they did have a fairly successful one as well. So there are one or two indications of good examples that we could see. Obviously, I'm sure you're always calling for one very soon, and South Africa has a very good knack of setting examples as well in the region. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on proceedings in South Africa. I see some of our friends from South Africa as well on the webinar. So just to know, no pressure, but we're looking forward to seeing how your spectrum award process turns out. There was another question as well regarding open access, and maybe just say that as well. It's an area that we've done research in. This is in terms of obviously creating some sort of open access networks, and the thing is, we just haven't seen it work anywhere, and that's been the major bane of this concept from our perspective. We haven't seen where a single wholesale network has been deployed and it has achieved the objectives that it was initially set out for. I think the closest we've seen to full implementation, has been in Mexico, but even that has not been producing the desired results. Rwanda has something similar in terms of a single wholesale network for 4G services. But again, that hasn't served the purposes of, for example, increasing coverage or reducing prices, because coverage still remains the same. Prices for 4G services are still high, and operators are still not able to actually even deploy new technology themselves. So we have not seen it really work, and we then would not be in a place to say, this is something that that industry is able to support. So I suppose until maybe a time in the very far future where industry develops to the extent that that sort of concept becomes a viable solution for connectivity needs, we'll have to remain with the views that we currently have. But once again, thank you everyone for making time to join us today. I would personally have loved for this to continue to go on. We can speak Spectrum all day, all night, 5 days a week, but unfortunately it has to come to an end. It's been a pleasure having you. If you have any questions, if there's anything that we've mentioned that you'd like a lot more detail on, please do feel free to reach out to myself or anybody else on the team, and we'll be more than happy to reach out and provide you with any additional insights. It's been a pleasure having you once again, and I hope that this pandemic situation is going to go away sometime soon, so that we'll be able to have these interactions in a more face-to-face manner. So thank you very, very much, and we can call it a day here. Thank you.